Well, I'm Philip Hickok, and I primarily play synthesizers, a little bit of bass guitar, some drums. Mm-hmm. That's about it. I learned violin was probably my first instrument I learned.
I got you. Where were you born, Phil?
Rockford, Illinois, which is a little town just south of the Wisconsin border in Illinois, about an hour and a half from Chicago.
Gotcha. What were your... Because I know, and we'll get into it, what you play now, what types of music you primarily play now, but initially, what were you listening to that attracted you? What kind of music?
Man, it was all over the spectrum. At the time, it was the 80s, so the synthesizers were prevalent then, big time. I grew up on Depeche Mode, Duran Duran, Rush, early Robert Plant solo stuff. I loved Principle of Moments, those early albums that were really good. And that's it, man. It was mostly 80s pop and new wave. And then slowly evolved into, the more you listen to stuff like Depeche Mode, the more underground you start to move.
Okay.
And that's where we got into what I make now, like industrial music. I started hearing, around that time era, you had Skinny Puppy, you had Einstürzende out of Germany, who were making music with jackhammers and steel bars and concrete. And I fell in love with it.
Now, when you're talking about like Depeche Mode, for instance, how old are you when you're listening to this?
5.
Really?
Maybe 4. My first CD, though, was Frank Zappa.
Okay.
It was his Overnight Sensation album.
Okay.
And I was 5 years old when I got that album.
What were your parents listening to?
That exact same stuff.
Really?
So my dad was a DJ for bars, and he would do weddings, stuff like that on the side. So he had quite the spectrum of music, but what he mainly listened to was, early 80s new wave.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Immediately the thought occurs to me that, because I guess when I ask that question of many musicians, I expect to hear a generation of music that preceded them, right? Their parents' stuff, and it's older stuff. It's not, maybe back in that day they were listening to whatever's on the radio as far as what's current, but to have your father be a DJ, it's basically his job to be on top of what's out right now.
Exactly.
So you had the benefit of hearing those things firsthand. And 5, that's wow.
Yeah.
And it was attracting you because of what you were hearing, or because it was a piece of your father. Like what did it?
He had music playing 24/7, much like I do now. If he was out working in the yard, music was blasting in the house. It was the 80s. You had those giant wood speakers the big Kenwoods or something aimed out the window.
Love them.
Yeah, and he would have that music blasting all the time. And I would have to say the early stuff that I really, really heard was a lot of Scorpions, Robert Plant solo. Most vivid memory is Principle of Moments, just playing that record playing on loop. I even have a copy of it on vinyl to this day.
Okay.
Because of it. And he has always musically been on top of stuff. Even today, he listens to industrial music and stuff like that. Like, he influenced me as a kid, and I influenced him as an adult.
Gotcha.
And we kind of switched roles in that aspect. And we're
that's pretty
constantly
cool.
trading music and stuff like that. So... having a 65-year-old man hanging out at a KMFDM concert,
Beautiful.
So, yeah.
That's funny. You grew up in the right era to be where you're at now, because that was it back then. I mean, synths were at their prime back then, or at least it was like their first coming, I guess you would say.
Right. They had gone from the few bands that were dabbling in them, like Rush or Pink Floyd, who had some synthesizers. Even Beatles had some
Hall & Oates
Mellotrons.
might be credited with the first.
Right. You get
first
some
use.
of the old school, like 60s, 70s, some would even argue 50s synthesizers were being used, but they weren't as mainstream until that early 80s hit came in. And you had that big British push of new wave coming in where, like you said, you've got Pet Shop Boys, Duran Duran, New Order, all these bands that they took the synthesizer, even Gary Newman, took the synthesizer from the background and was like, no, we can make a whole song on this now.
Yeah.
And that's, the 80s was ideal for that.
It was a tech flush back then, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It really was. Because, what comes to mind, too, for me is the dawn of hip-hop. The hip-hop was created on the back of sequencers.
Right.
And they came out in the early 80s.
Yeah, the TR-808 came
That's
out
right.
in 1981, which is the, the infamous 808 kick that everybody loves.
Yeah.
So, crediting your shirt.
Right,
So,
yeah. Which you can find on NewOrleansMusicians.com, just saying.
Get it? And, the infamous cowbell that was in early 80s hip-hop, that chimey cowbell that comes from the 808.
It's so funny because none of them sound like what there's, like the clap doesn't sound like a real clap.
No.
The snare doesn't sound like any snare you've ever heard. And the cowbell, for instance.
Yeah.
But it's become iconic. And those 808s, the TR-808s, the original ones right now,
Yeah.
how much are they going for? You probably know. Like $1,000?
Between $8,000 to $10,000, actually.
Really?
Yeah, they're insane.
Yeah.
And they don't have MIDI on them, which, so when you sync them, you have to go to the old school. Either you run an audio out from your rim shot to get your pulse of electricity for your gate to synchronize it and stuff like that. It's crazy.
Yeah.
And, Behringer's making all kinds of cool remakes. I actually just sold my clone of the 808.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're insane on all that old equipment. The old 303, which was supposed to replace a bass guitarist in bands, and it sounded nothing like a bass guitar. It's that squelchy, annoying sound. I mean, I like them, but
Yeah.
it's definitely not.
Well,
a bass
I think we
guitar.
all look at those fondly with a bit of nostalgia,
Right.
Right. And so you're a child listening to this coming up, and you said your first CD was Frank Zappa, so you knew that
Correct.
this electronic music was something totally different.
Yes. Well, Frank Zappa in the 70s, even with Mothers of Invention, was experimenting with George Duke, who was playing synthesizers for him at the time.
Okay.
Amazing keyboardist. Mm-hmm. He was messing around with an ARP Odyssey on stage, and Frank Zappa used to give him these crazy patches that he would dial up on the Odyssey. So even in Overnight Sensation and some of the early Zappa work, well, not the early Zappa work, his solo stuff outside of Mothers, has some synthesizer work in it, and it was bizarre sounding.
Okay.
I couldn't even recreate his patches to this day, and I've got the equipment that he used, and I still have no idea.
Right.
No idea how to do it.
When you're coming into your own a little bit further down the line, let's say 12 to 14, and you're choosing more of your own music, because I would imagine initially you're just kind of taking what you were kind of grifting from your father or peeking in on and listening to. When you start to get out on your own a bit and choose your own music, what are you choosing?
So I, like all kids around that age, started becoming rebellious. And I wanted to get away from the synthesizer music, and I actually got into death metal big time. Early Napalm Death, and stuff like that. A little bit of Fear Factory, and some of the later Rollins band stuff.
Okay.
When Henry Rollins was doing his solo stuff. The Wait album, which had Liar and Disconnect, stuff like that. And that was right around that time, 91, 92. And, of course, 90s grunge. I was absolutely obsessed with Alice in Chains and Nirvana and that sound that was coming out of that. I was actually just listening to a bunch yesterday.
Yeah.
So I started to swing far from the synthesizers from a listening standpoint as a fan, but at the same time started experimenting with music around then. I cut my first album at 14. So.
Okay. Well, that's interesting because what are your choices of genres and writing styles? Because you've just recently switched what your mainstays are, I guess.
Yeah. So, well, at that time, I was really big into dissonance. So, to roll back even further again with the family, is my dad worked in a factory, and my grandfather owned said factory. My mother worked in the factory, all my aunts and uncles did. So I was constantly at the factory as a kid. If I had a day off of school or something like that, you know, they didn't dump us, they didn't have trampoline parks and stuff like that for us back then. They would take us to work. And I would sit in the factory all day listening to the machinery, and there's a certain timing that's constantly going with it, and the clanking bells and the metal bars. It's a screw machine factory, so they get these they got these big metal rods that they would make into valves and stuff like that through the machine cutting.
Okay.
And all of it had a timing that was like music. And at the time I was listening to death metal and heavy stuff, which has that really heavy 4/4. There's really not much variation in death metal. It's just 4/4 all the time. It's not like Rush where they get 14 time signatures in one song. Right. And the machinery reminded me of the death metal without the guitars. So I started making music that kind of utilized that sound and utilized that cadence, if you will.
Okay.
In creating pure dissonance. My first album was pretty much just heavy noise, and I recorded the thing in a factory while the machines were running and kept time to the machines. So that's where the whole music passion to create came from.
What year are we talking about? Help me out with the math.
So that was 1994 going into 1995.
Okay.
So yeah, that was, and that's when I, again, started learning a little bit more about, when you're hanging out with the death metal kids, there's a lot of goth kids there, and the goth kids bring their music. And at the time, you know, it's Skinny Puppy, it's KMFDM, early Nine Inch Nails when Trent Reznor was harsh and heavy.
Right.
And so those lines started blurring a lot.
Sure, you could hear some of those factory elements in there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and that's when I made the transition, I guess.
What was your first piece of equipment for making anything?
The first non-recorded piece of equipment was a Casio keyboard, a little toy Casio that I played with. Had a violin in 3rd grade, took violin lessons, which I think comes out in my music later in life, as I do a lot of pads and string work.
Okay.
And I think that goes back to my being 8 years old and playing a violin. But the first recording piece of equipment was an Ensoniq Mirage, which is a old school sampler from like 1984.
Okay.
I found it at a music shop.
And you were buying this in the mid-90s?
Yes.
Is that right? Okay.
Yes. So it was old, outdated piece of junk is the way the company looked at it. Now you can't find them for under $1,000.
Sure.
But at the time, I think I paid $150 for the thing.
Yeah.
And
why that? Just curious.
So I was obsessed with, by that time, I was obsessed with Skinny Puppy. That was my band. Still my favorite band to this day. But they recorded a lot of their music on an 808, 2 Ensoniq Mirages, and a Ensoniq ESQ1 synthesizer. And the Mirage has a sound to it. It's a sampler.
Okay.
But it has an analog filter in it, but it's all programmed in hexadecimal.
Okay.
So you have to know some low-level computer programming language just to even dial in how to use the machine.
Wow.
And but it's a lo-fi sampler, so it recorded everything. This is going to be tech geeky for all the tech geeks out there.
Lay it out, man. They got tech geeks that listen to this show too.
29 kilohertz at 8-bit. So your sound that was coming out, whatever you sampled in, and you only had a 1 to 2 second sample time at that frequency range and that rate, the sample rate. So no matter what you recorded into it, it sounded totally different when it came back out.
Okay.
And I used that along with an old DOS-based computer to sequence.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but
no, you're good.
So being regurgitated at 8-bit changed it, and this was desirable, or this was just was random desirable, or was it something that it did that it could be relied on to do to that sample?
It was very reliable. It became an effects unit, if you will.
Okay.
We found at the time, and it's funny because my first band's me and my brother. and my brother was learning drums. And we would sample, he'd hit a snare drum, we'd put it in, it would come out crunched and gritty, and it mangled. I mean, it was just a totally mangled sound. I would sample my voice just humming. Sample it in there, and it would sound like a sawtooth wave on a Moog or something. It was just real gritty, and that analog filter gave it a nice dial in on that sound. So, yeah, we mainly used it as an effects unit.
Okay.
So we would sample everything in and then spit it back out into, we used a wave pad on Windows 3.1.
Okay.
And you had that little sound recorder app that came with Windows, and we'd hit record, play the sound, and then we'd sequence it out on an old tracking program.
That's determination, brother.
It was a process. And as people who weren't musicians, like I said, I learned violin, and I did it for 1 year in school. So I didn't know how to play a keyboard. I didn't know what a scale was. I had no clue.
Right.
So...
Well, neither did the first jazz musicians. It doesn't matter.
Right.
You know?
Right. And later on, we look back at it, and it was like, okay, that was actually still musical, because you know what you hear by ear.
Sure.
That sounds right, that sounds bad, so on and so forth. But it was all technical. Everything we did was technical. You programmed the notes by note. You would C4 hits for this long, C3 plays for this long, so on and so forth. And it was more mathematical than it was musical at the time. So it created that sound, again, that machine type sound, because it's hard on and off on every instrument, every note, everything. And it kind of created that sound. Yeah.
I mean, 8-bit, I don't know if it's the right terminology, but I mean, it's basically truncating sounds. It's crunching things up, like you said, which is the best way to put it.
Right.
But I got to ask, because I'm trying to remember I'm not a big gamer dude, but I'm trying to remember what was out at that time. I mean, did you have Super Nintendo, or had it gone further, like 94 to 96? The reason I'm asking is because 8-bit was like Atari. That was like Atari sounds.
Yeah, 8-bit was, and you got to remember 8-bit. When you talk of 8-bit video games, I'm a huge gamer. Right? 8-bit video games, that wasn't just your sound, that was your processing entirely was 8-bit.
Right, I understand. So I mean, it had that effect. It had the effect that you were playing with.
Right.
On the sounds in that technology.
Right, those sound chips that they were using then.
So what I'm getting at is, why did it, and it might be, I guess you had to be their response, I'm not sure, but why did it appeal to you so much? Did it not sound a bit antiquated to you? Did it not sound like a step back instead of a step forward? Do you know what I mean?
It sounded like a step aside.
Okay.
So
fair enough.
You figure early 90s is when we started having the big pop craze. That's when you started getting, everything started to sound kind of like how it does now when it comes to mainstream radio. It had that very processed and cleaned sound.
Sure.
Everything was moving forward. Philips and Sony released the Red Book standard saying, all music has to be at 44.1 kilohertz at 16-bit.
Right.
And now they're talking, 24-bit and stuff like that.
Well, I was about to say, that's the stuff conspiracies are made of these days, but
right.
That might be for another show,
But to me, it sounded different, and I wanted to sound different. And I've always lived by the philosophy, I'd rather be a flower, even if it's an ugly flower, than a blade of grass.
Sure.
I don't want to get lost in the field.
Sure.
And one, I wasn't listening to the pop music at the time. I mean, I had a Criss Cross CD, I think, when that came out. And
it's okay. I might have. Yeah.
But I also had a lot of Green Jello and stuff like that too. So, but it sounded different, and I felt every band that I had liked in the past had a different sound.
Okay.
So
that was the era. I mean, the early 90s was, if you wanted different, they churned more out in the early 90s.
Right.
Every genre.
Right. You have, and that's where I feel, at least in mainstream music, where it kind of ended with the experimental side of who we release and what we do.
Okay.
So grunge made it big out of Seattle. You had Trent bringing Nine Inch Nails into the mainstream, which on the coattails of him you had Stabbing Westward, Gravity Kills, Lords of Acid, things like that all came in behind him.
Yes.
And became very mainstream. Marilyn Manson, his careers, it might be edgy to say, but
to be determined, right?
Yeah. I mean, that was because of Trent and Nine Inch Nails, and if record labels hadn't given the opportunity to these bands, it would have been, I think, kind of what we're seeing today, where it's all just one thing.
But you know what? It's funny though. You named Nirvana. I mean, that wasn't the only time that a record company's exec's head rolled because he missed that bus.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I mean, that was victory for guys like us. You know, I mean,
Absolutely.
We didn't know it at the time, but I mean, reading about those things, at least I didn't. And reading about those things now, I'm like, good. There was more to it than because I mean, I was head up my ass kid. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
I was
Right.
too pre-concerned with the next party or whatever.
Yeah.
You know. So I mean,
Same.
I didn't appreciate art for art's sake. I appreciated art as part of the moment, but it's okay because there are things that were born that I'll never forget, and it's based on these soundtracks to our lives. So I mean, I appreciate it for that and so much more now. You know, was any of this on the, I guess, the music business side? Was anything motivating you? Did you have aspirations? Did you see these other bands that were coming out and think to yourself, that could be me? Or was it just a pursuit?
It was, at first it was, let's have fun.
Okay.
Like you said, it was a party. And, you know, in the 90s and the 80s, it was still, bands were still really popular, especially local bands. You know, you got all the girls, you had all the fun, you had all the parties.
Sure.
So that was more or less what it was at that time. We were doing shows and little concerts at cafes, things like that, and getting banned from all of them because we were big into shock rock. So, because we felt our music was, you couldn't dance to it, so we got to give you something to see. And so we do like recreations of horror shows and stuff like that. And
you got to stop for a minute and describe one of these because, and you said shock rock, but I think you're not saying rock really.
No, shock industrial.
Okay. Right.
Again, taking a page out of Skinny Puppy again, who were massive influences to us at the time. Skinny Puppy used to, you know, Ogre would stick an ice pick in his arm on stage. Very, what's his name? Iggy Pop.
Right.
You know, Iggy Pop was big into it. And even before that, you had Screamin' Jay Hawkins in the 50s, who used to come out on stage in a big coffin and had a whole witch doctor show he would put on. But we were animal rights fans back then, and so I would dress with like a pig mask on, and my brother being the drummer. At some point during the show, we'd have this crazy sequence of upbeat music, and I would drag him out from behind it and perform surgery on him on stage. And we'd have all these fake intestines and lots of blood, balloons filled with fake blood that we'd make out of Caro syrup. So when it would poke it, blood would spurt and stuff.
Y'all really on one, huh?
Yeah, we were crazy about it because we felt like, again, our music was instrumental, and it was very abrasive. It didn't have much, like I said, that you could dance to. You couldn't mosh to it. It wasn't fast or heavy enough. It was just different enough. So, and nobody wants to see two kids at the time. You know, I'm 14. My brother was 10. Sitting on stage with a bunch of keyboards and not even a bunch, a keyboard with a computer and a drummer.
Sure.
So, yeah, we'd go crazy with it. And around that time, going just a little further into the late 90s, I was with the band Gerbling. And that was like punk meets industrial. And that was, we would smash TVs and throw them into the crowd. And
this was strictly local? This is formed the members, I'm saying. It was formed of.
Yeah, we didn't. So, to answer your question, I've strayed so far from was we never cared if we got famous. it wasn't about that. It never really was.
Yeah.
We knew we'd never be rich making the music we make. We knew if we wanted to, we'd go cut some pop songs and go sell out. But it was very much the punk mentality, I guess.
Yeah.
It was do it for the fun of it. And being that close to Chicago, we were in the right spot. Chicago had a huge industrial scene in the early 90s and mid 90s. Yeah. One of the biggest record labels in the industrial music scene was Wax Trax Records, which was out of Chicago, which was formed out of a record store.
Okay.
And that's where, Nine Inch Nails got their start, KMFDM, Ministry. I mean, everybody that was anybody. My Life with a Thrill, Kill Cult. Anybody that was anybody in industrial music had an album with Wax Trax.
Gotcha.
And we were 90 minutes away.
Let me ask you, and it might be something that you could only answer now. Looking back, I'm not sure. Being that you weren't concerned with, or you didn't have any preconceived notions of timing signatures, or weren't worried about making songs that had any type of appeal or anything that somebody could dance to, like none of these were preconceived notions in your minds. Is that freeing? Does that free you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have since learned music theory, and I feel like I am trapped musically now.
You're on the grid now.
Yeah. Because I catch myself going, oh, well, that note doesn't technically follow the scale I'm working in and stuff like that, and I hate that.
Yeah.
Back then, it was very liberating. You would sit down and just start recording. You didn't care.
Yeah.
And there was no rules. There's just no rules to the music.
Yeah.
And if you had a song that was a verse that was 5 minutes long, then it was a 5-minute verse. There was no pre-chorus, chorus, bridge, all that kind of stuff. It was, you just make what you wanted. And we got a fan base, oddly, from that.
Yeah. Gerbling?
Gerbling.
Gerbling? Okay.
Yeah. Well, Gerbling kind of had a fan base, and it was mainly based on the show.
Okay. I was asking which one you were talking about when you started to say
Schwein, the first one.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
That one, we were selling cassette tapes at the time because that was the era.
Yeah.
We were one of the first local bands in Rockford that actually got a CD burner. I had a job at 15 working at Kmart, and I saved up to buy a CD burner, which at the time was $600.
Oh my God.
And installed it in my computer, and we were cutting CDs at 1x speed because that's all they were burning at the time. So hour-long CD was an hour of burning, and it would fail sometimes.
Right.
And CDs cost, $10 a piece back then to burn. So we'd have to sell our local CDs for $15 a piece. But we were doing pretty good. Again, we weren't paying bills or anything like that. But
and that was the one that was with your brother?
Yes, that was Nox Fine.
Okay.
We got featured in Industrial Nation magazine, which was a big magazine publication at the time.
Is he still 10? And you're, what, 14, you said?
Yeah.
Wow.
I was 14.
Got a magazine feature at 10 and 14.
Yeah. They used to jokingly call us the Satanic Hanson. Because Hanson was huge with Mbop at the time.
Sure, yeah.
So, yeah.
That's funny. There was something, so you were talking about Wax Trax, and 9 Inch Nails was on there, Ministry. I've got one of their cassettes right over there right now, I guarantee you. Who was the dudes, you could answer this for me, had that song Du Hast Me?
Rammstein.
Rammstein, okay.
Yeah.
So they were big during that era as well.
Yeah, so their first album came out in 94 in Germany, which was Herzeleid. And that's a genre that they call over in Germany Neudeutsch Harte, which is New German Hard, is what it stands for. And it's a industrial metal that really took off over there.
So that's this era that we're speaking of, and where you're starting to create that type of music. But it seems like what you were creating then was different from what you were making in the factory initially. And then it seems like what you were creating, what you chose to create was different from, let's say, during the era of grunge, which, I mean, was all this intentional, or was it you just wanted to try something? Were you trying to create something you weren't hearing? I mean, what was the quest? Do you know?
Mainly, we were wanting to create something we weren't hearing, mixed with we were doing what we thought sounded cool at the time.
I mean, I understand that you did it because it sounded cool to you at the time. I was just curious if there was a underlying reason why it wasn't what you were doing prior, wasn't what you were doing at that moment, and you did that 2 or 3 times so far in the course of this story.
Right.
But also you switched genres coming up because you were listening to a lot of 80s synth music, and then you rebel yourself and start listening to heavy metal.
Yeah.
And that's nothing like what you start creating once it's time for you to create.
Right. And I think it's a combination of poverty. We were very poor at the time. We were, eating mac and cheese every day, which was our ramen in the 80s and 90s.
Right.
And
it's a good way to explain.
And we couldn't afford real instruments. I mean, I remember I had to beg and plead to get a guitar amp this big just to hear what I was playing on my keyboard outside of headphones. So I think it was a combination of lack of skill, lack of money, and a weird obsession with sound.
Sure.
Sound. I almost want to say it's almost like synesthesia, where it triggers other senses.
You see it, yeah.
For me, I taste it. I taste the metallic sound of certain synth frequencies and stuff like that.
That's funny.
So, and I feel like it was weird. We made what we wanted.
Yeah.
It's I don't know how to describe it other than that, man. It was just whatever sounded right.
Sure, I get it. Sometimes it's without explanation. I get it.
And later on, when the genre changed, when I started doing more electronic, clean cut stuff, was around 96 to 99. I got introduced to the rave scene and started going to raves. So then you start hearing the 303s and the Juno 1s, the Alpha Juno 1s and stuff like that, where everything is very polished and very clean, but it is dancey and high energy.
There was so many things.
Yeah.
Let me ask, I'm going to assume if you're there in the beginning for the rave scene, if you want to call it that, or drum and bass, jungle music, whatever. Is it the first time? I mean, we all experienced our fair share of the British invasion and what that meant. It became and was meant to be highly Americanized, if you ask me. But I'm leading up to a question with the rave music and that genre. Do you feel as though that was the first experience for you with European, like a heavy European influence? Because the stuff in the beginning was coming from there.
Yep.
It wasn't being born here.
No. So, outside of Chicago house, the music that got me into the rave scene is called Gabba or Gabber or hardcore.
Okay.
And it comes out of Holland. Rotterdam, the city of Rotterdam, Holland to be specifically. And it was very heavy, very distorted, very dark, very European, as you're saying.
Right, yeah.
There was nothing like that in America. Because at the time, American techno was like that Don't Call Me Baby song and stuff like that, where it was very pop. And this was instrumental. It was using Hoover synths, where it's just foreboding and dark and heavy, and we're talking like average house songs like 110 to 130 BPM. This stuff was minimizing at 160 BPM, and some of it that came over was starting to get in the 200-300 BPM era where people are moshing at raves. And so it was crazy because they're wearing the bright colored stuff and punching each other in the head. and
friendly fire.
Yeah. And the gabber scene really hit me with that. And even then it was stumbling across the CD. And this is one thing that people don't really understand now, is back then you had CD shops that would buy used CDs, and you would go hit them up. And me personally, I would do what I called album shopping or label shopping. So Skinny Puppy was on Network Records. So I'd flip through CDs and I would look on the back. What label are they on? Oh, they're on Network.
Nice.
I'm going to buy them.
Yes.
I don't know who they are. I'm going to buy them. And I did it with, wax tracks, stuff like that. Well, at the time, this artist out of Chicago named Delta 9 had released an album on Earache, which is a metal label.
Okay.
And at the time, Napalm Death was on it, and I was a big Napalm Death fan still. And so I was flipping through, and I saw Earache, and I looked at the front, and it was a techno CD, and I'm like, what the hell, I'll buy it. Why not? And
how did you know it was a techno CD? Just curious.
It had the really bad 90s CGI on it, the weird balls that you saw Beyond Mind's Eye and stuff like that.
Sure.
And
That's
so,
funny.
yeah,
Okay.
and no other bands were doing that. Just
you
DJs
felt
were.
it in an image. That's hilarious.
And and I took it home, and my dad and I actually listened to it in the car on the way home, and he was like, "This is horrible." And it was literally a TR-909 drum machine run through a distortion pedal, just for an hour straight. 160 to 250, I think. No, 240 was the fastest track on there, 240 BPM. And it was his Disco Inferno album, in case anybody wants to look it up. And I heard that, and I was like, this is awesome. It's the distorted, crazy stuff that I'm making.
Yeah.
But it's danceable now, because I'm not making dance music. And it's big enough to get on a label, which was an inspiration at the time because I'm broke.
Definitely would have been my next question. I mean, that's got to be inspiring.
Yeah. At the time, I'm 5 years into making, 96, I was, 2 years into making music, going on 3. And we were making like $50 a show, maybe. CDs were profiting $1 or $2 per CD, which, today is amazing. But back then it was horrible because that's where you made your money. And our merch was really bad. I had a friend who had a silk screen, and we would just press our shirts. And I was like, okay, maybe I can do this stuff. I know how to make it. I know that sound well because, I've experimented. Mm-hmm. And so I started making gabber and hardcore techno at the time and started learning how to DJ. Because you go to a rave, you see a guy with 2 records and he's playing. Back then it was all vinyl still when it came to DJs. And I had a friend whose name is Jess1. That's his DJ name.
Okay.
He's a Chicago house DJ. Pretty big house DJ, actually. And he was living in Rockford at the time, and he was the one throwing all the events. So got connected with him. He started showing me how to DJ. And then, I did DJing for 14, 15 years.
That's a pricey hobby, man.
Yes.
So, at this point in time, what are you doing?
So,
what are you doing to get money?
Never quit your day job. So, at that time, let's see, I was doing odd jobs. I was working in IT a little bit.
Okay.
Towards the end of my teenage years, because I was experimenting with electronics, so I started learning technology side of things, which allowed me to get into IT. And IT in the late 90s, there was no degrees on that stuff or anything like that. Computers, you still got to remember, our home computers are still fairly kind of new. And so I got hired at 17 years old doing an IT job, a network administrator, with no training whatsoever.
Nice.
And that paid pretty decently. I was making I would say like $30,000 a year at the time, which in 90, $8.99. That was pretty damn good. I mean,
Yeah. And you're how old?
At that time, I was 17. Yeah.
Who cares what it is on the market? That's great for a 17-year-old.
Right. And I was, I had rented a house in downtown Rockford, in the roughest neighborhood you could ever get to, probably. And go to sleep to shootings kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it was my place, and I could put my studio in there and start building, and that's what I did. I started working on, I'd save up and buy one turntable, and then I'd buy a mixer after a couple months, and then another table.
It's not cheap. That's why I brought it up.
Yep. Yeah. It was years in the building. My first set was a cheap junk set. It was for DJing. They had Newmark had a DJ in the box set. I think it was $200, and it was 2 belt drive turntables and this really awful mixer that just had volume up and down.
Where is this
gain.
Pro Sound and Stage Lighting? You're getting this from? Where are you getting this from?
At the time, there was a shop in Rockford called Gazzardo's.
Oh, okay. So this is a place, brick and mortar, you're going down to. Okay.
Absolutely. Guitar Center was still a small company, kind of. I mean, not tiny, but they weren't in the small towns like Rockford.
Gotcha.
If you wanted to go to Guitar Center, you'd go to Chicago. So it was all local. Everything was local then.
And I'd also like to bring up, I mean, I'm picturing what you had to start obtaining to be able to do this, and you're just now getting out on your own at the same time. So I mean, that's a lot to tackle.
Yeah.
You're spinning vinyl?
Yes. And,
okay.
And having to buy the records. And back then the records were $20 a pop, which about what they are now, 25.
Yeah, for where they're coming from and the content you were paying.
Yeah. I mean, at the time, you figure you could get a cheap drum machine around what you were buying one record for. And if it was a double vinyl, forget about it. It was, that was your weekly spending fund right there, gone. And it was a lot of sleeping on a mattress on the floor if you had a mattress. I became very fond of futon beds from Walmart.
Didn't we all?
Yeah.
Not fond of, but
it was
a staple.
Yeah, I mean, it was a $100 bed and couch in one.
Right.
My God,
Isn't that impressive?
Yeah. So, I lived on futons. Gosh, I want to say the first 10 years on my own.
Yeah.
I lived on those things. And moved to Chicago. That was about 99. And got connected with DJs, Rave World, which was a website.
Oh, okay. I was about to say, because it was a world. Like, I'm thinking of the world of raves overtook me during the 90s.
Rave World and Decepticon Unit, which were two big... Decepticon Unit was a label and a promoter, and then Raver World was a promoter. And it was dial-up internet days, raverworld.com, and they got me connected with gigs. So I was gigging every weekend as a DJ, and then every other weekend as a musician.
What types of places? Because in the beginning you said as a musician there was cafes.
Yeah. So for DJing, it was the early days of rave. So you're talking, you'd go to Libertyville, Wisconsin, and there'd be a rundown, or Racine. I remember playing at a old church that had been abandoned, and it was collapsing around you while you're DJing, and there's the rave in there. Or there was this one Asian restaurant in Chicago that they would close at 9 o'clock. They would move all the tables out and then put one table out for the turntables to go onto, and we'd have a rave in, the Asian restaurant. Photon Arena, which was a laser tag arena that they turned into a rave house, stuff like that.
You were seeing more people at this point, though.
All the time. I mean, we're talking... So, from the cafe shows where there was one in Rockford called That One Place, and that was the one we always played at. Both in Gerbeling and Knoxvine. I lived at That One Place. And you're talking 20 to 50 people tops.
Right.
These raves, we were doing 500 to 1,000 people.
It's never come up because I haven't interviewed anybody in your genre of music, but it brings back so many fond memories. It was a world unto itself.
Yeah.
The rave scene.
Yeah.
was a world unto itself.
Absolutely.
The promoters were monsters back then.
Oh yeah.
They really knew how to do it, and I guess it was a subculture that just exploded, that helped it. But I mean, I'm listening to what you're saying, and I'm also at the same time thinking about all of these Photech, Goldie, Lemon D. Who else did I start going through all of these
Ronnie
names?
Size and Jungle
Ronnie
Brothers.
Size, yes. Just it was again, and you found it back then. You found it. You found what you weren't hearing anywhere. It had just because it had just arrived. But these were a foreign man from a foreign land. Like, you were hearing things that crossed the pond. You know, came over from different parts of Europe and just revolutionized.
Absolutely. And they did it out of their basements. They were not huge celebrities. Like you said, it was a world unto itself because it was created in people's garages and basements.
Sure.
And there was a certain passion for it. I always attribute it to punk. To me, it was the next evolution of punk. So punk for me was 70s, 80s, big time. And into the 90s, that all changed into two genres, grunge and techno. And the grunge side went more commercial, and I still love it. And then the techno side continued that underground vibe, where shows weren't in big venues, but they drew big crowds. And people were traveling, like you said, from overseas all the time. You know, General Levy from, England and stuff like that coming over and spinning. And it was totally different and unique, I guess is the best way to describe it. Like you said, it was, if you weren't in it, you didn't see it, you didn't know about it, you didn't hear about it. But if you were in it, you almost didn't see outside of it.
It'll suck you in. I remember, I mean, I couldn't tell you who was playing or where it was, but I remember the feeling that I got the first time I set foot in a rave. It was just like this mysterious wonderland that engulfed everything. It just ingested everything around it and became something else.
Yeah.
It was unbelievable.
Yeah. And it's one of those things, it's like, I always attribute it like skydiving. You could try to explain it to people who have never seen it or who have done it.
Yeah, I get it.
But they're never going to get that feeling.
Right, you have to be there.
Right, you have to experience it to know it. And that experience, unfortunately, is just gone.
Well, I was about to say, I think that's what kind of makes it so precious to us now. Like, you'd be hard-pressed to hear me talk about it, something else so passionately as I'm talking about this right now. And it's, know why? Because you'll never be able to go there again.
No.
You'll never be able to see it, smell it, feel it ever again. You could watch documentaries. You could talk to people that were there. I won't be able to capture it for y'all. You're just going to have to do your research, or, hopefully you were there. And if you missed it, do some research, man. Just, that's the best you can. That's the best you can hope for. What was it like? Because I can't comment on that. I can comment from the dance floor side. What was it like on the DJ booth side for you?
You felt like a god. I guess is the best way to put it. One, half the crowd's on drugs.
Sure.
Let's be honest. Ecstasy was huge.
Half is being very generous.
I'm trying to not give it that credit where everybody thought they were just ecstasy dens, but yeah. But you'd be up there and everybody would be moving to the beat you're creating. It's a sea of people and it's just bouncing. Perfect time the whole time. And if you stop the beat, they stop. If you start the beat, they start the beat. And there's a certain feeling when you're in a band on stage, you're a cog in the machine.
Sure.
When you're the DJ, you are the machine. That's it. And it's a massive ego boost. It's a lot of fun. And it's, for me, I always felt it was like a playground. It was a playground with an audience.
Hey, have you heard about NewOrleansMusicians.com? It's a place where articles, music videos, interviews, and streaming music from Louisiana musicians can be found. Fans can join free. Music business professionals can join free too. And Louisiana musicians can join for free as well. It's also the place where Louisiana bands go to network and get free promotion. We've definitely got plenty, like this band. Check them out.
You would try dropping in music that wasn't supposed to be dropped in with it and stuff. I actually got my second DJ name from doing that, experimenting with pop music in the noisy stuff, and I got the name KillPoP from it. But it was being able to control 2,000 people or whatever at once. Mm-hmm. That's really what it felt like, and you were the star at that time.
Sure.
And
they were really massive. They became massive egos back then. I don't.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if that's still a thing where DJs become this, like Kiyoki became a caricature of himself.
Just gonna mention Kiyoki.
Right?
Yeah.
It just fucking puts a smile on your face, right? Surreal. Let me ask though. There are certain elements of this that shouldn't have been tickling your fancy, if you ask me, because some of the things that you've spoken about that you were fond of, the characteristics that music possessed for you and why it appealed to you. I mean, it didn't tickle any mathematical fancy, I would guess. It didn't tickle any technical fancy. I guess that's why it was a playground, because it wasn't so hard to do. I mean, it is and it isn't. Don't get me wrong. I'm not mitigating what DJs do. I'm just saying background. But your background possessed a lot more technicalities than what is required of a DJ, no matter the genre.
Absolutely. And DJing, again, and it's going to sound pretentious as hell, but DJing back then is a lot different than DJing now. DJing now, you got MP3s, you hit sync, you're done.
Nobody can argue with that statement.
Right. With back then, you're trying to beat match vinyl. You've got to adjust the speed of the tables, stuff like that. Plus, you want to match the key, things like that. From a production side, like you're talking about, where the instrumentation is really simplistic, and it is. I mean, you're talking 4, 8, 16 bar loops for 2.5 minutes with some slight variation at some point, and that's your song, right? Yeah. I was writing songs in 10 minutes tops back then. But for me, what made it cool is, and you'd really have to look at the hardcore scene, because that was a subgenre of that rave. So there was rave, and then there was like hardcore rave. Sure. And when you get into like the hardcore and breakcore, which is another genre of crazy distorted beats and stuff like that, that's where the appeal kind of was for me. It was still distorted, it was still edgy. You know, we're teenagers at the time, so being that edgy teen who has that punk mentality and fight, screw the mainstream type mentality, that's where I found my passion in it. And even the scene itself was a anti-normal scene. Like you said, it was a world unto itself, so that was also part of the appeal. It was kind of built upon that, now that you mention it, really. Yeah, it was, we're doing something we're not supposed to, kind of thing. Yeah. You're doing it in shady places, in shady neighborhoods where, you know, you might get robbed on your way to the venue. Yeah. And there was no laws, no rules, no nothing at them. And that was the appeal. I think. I have to say that I've really enjoyed listening to you draw the assimilations between that music and punk, because I mean, it was either yesterday or this morning that I was talking about the assimilations that were drawn between punk music and hip hop music. Punk preceded hip hop not by much. No. And they were born out of the same principles. Correct. And it's been fun to hear you draw the same parallels with this techno aspect, and grunge for that matter, because I don't know, the sentiment is what really mattered to us back then, and probably still does now. Right. I don't know that it's got a time period to it, but
it's dear to me.
Right.
And I mean, a lot of us can't argue with the fact that we look around us and find society a little fucked up, man. You know what I'm saying? And it's some shit that we don't want to be a part of. I mean, you got your people that look like an Old Navy commercial and they're happy living in that commercial, but you got other people that despise it. You know what I'm saying? But they're not bad.
Right.
But so, I mean, like you were talking about, a subculture is born, I guess. And you realize that when you were in the midst of it.
Right. And I'm curious to see what comes out of this. Because if you look at history, anytime that there's some kind of heavy strife, that's when a form of punk, if you will, comes out. So in the 60s and 70s in England, you had a huge poverty issue going on. And that's where, Sex Pistols and stuff like that come out of. If you look at early hip-hop, it's from early 80s, rough neighborhoods and, CIA, we're not going to say implanting drugs in neighborhoods, but maybe doing so. And doing stuff like that creates hip-hop, people making music on their own in their basements and garages, just like punk was at the time. In early 90s, you have this big shift to conformity from 80s where everybody was loose and crazy, which was also the 60s going into the 70s. And with the 90s and into the 2000s, that's when rave really peaked out.
Yeah.
Early 2000, late 90s. And that's when we started playing in giant venues. We started getting, Expo Center downtown and stuff like that. I'm curious to see, now that we're going through hard times now as a society, what's going to come out.
Right.
Because it's not going to be, what we're hearing on the radio. It's going to be, there's going to be something. And I've heard some stuff. I went, downtown Baton Rouge and heard some people DJing a kind of music called rhythm dubstep.
Sure.
Heavy, screechy, distorted. It's like dubstep, but it's distorted and just psychotic, right?
Yeah.
And I think that might be what we're starting to, I think that might be what's going to come out of this, is because, again, those artists, they're passionate about it. They love doing it. They're making it on their laptops in their basements. They're not making it in big production studios, just like we did when we did our time. And it's edgy, it's loud, it's violent. It's all the markings of the new wave punk, if you will.
Sure.
So,
are you saying that you think dubstep is one of the front runners to come out as a result of?
I think rhythm dubstep is. So standard dubstep, I think, is just the next evolution of techno. Standard dubstep, we're talking like Skrillex, stuff like that. That's more of the hybridization of like hip hop and techno.
Sure.
This rhythm stuff it's different. Think of the dubstep drops, but the entire song is the drop. And so you got that high piercing screeching synthesizer. Now run that through a distortion pedal. Now throw a compressor on it where it compresses with the kick. It side chains off the kick constantly. So you've got this weird crunching, just chompy sound. It's the best way I can describe it.
Sure.
And I think something like that, if it's not that, something like that will become the next wave of whatever the punk mentality is.
Sure. I found myself wondering how technology is going to affect that. And I say that because I don't know. I guess I look back on this with a degree of fondness. The analog synths, the analog effects, just the analog hardware. I can't not be drawn to that every time I see it physically, every time I hear it in something. Or I realize it came from that era and that's what I'm listening to. My hairs might stand up a little bit taller just because of it. Do you know what I'm saying? So it occurs to me when I'm hearing that is there anything lost on these leaps in technology when the next genre of music is born, in your opinion?
If anything, I think the old stuff comes back more. So the new technology, when it comes to, I would say, synthesizers specifically, it's like they followed the music trend. They want clean, polished sound.
Okay.
The ability to push digital synthesizers, and not all digitals. I mean, some digitals are amazing. The Virus series, the Hydra Synth, those are amazing synthesizers that you can push to every boundary and blow your speakers out if you wanted to. But the real edge case stuff comes from analog synthesizers and from analog effects. A digital distortion sounds like trash on a kick drum. You put an analog distortion, like even a classic DS1 Boss pedal, you run a kick through that, it's going to sound beautiful. It sounds amazing every time. So I think that with modern companies cloning some of the old stuff, like the Behringers are doing, the Eurorack
Cloning
stuff,
the analog gear.
correct.
Okay.
And they're making them analog. They're still analog.
Right.
But they're more modernized so they don't just slip out of tune and stuff like that, which some would say is part of the charm of analog equipment, is you lose tuning with time and with your frequencies of electricity. But I would say Eurorack is another step to keeping the analog feel, but with the new music.
What is Eurorack?
So that's modular synthesis.
Okay.
So that last song I sent you was done entirely on a modular synth.
Okay.
So yeah, and that's again purely analog to the point where you're patching electrical voltage to everything. You can't just turn it on and play. It won't work.
Sure.
So and you're building it piece by piece. So I think that's where it's all going to come from. I mean, a lot of rhythm is made on VSTs, but then another good chunk of it is made on analog gear still, because there's just a certain grit that comes with analog that you just can't recreate.
Yeah, you got to tell me.
Yeah.
Gives me hope for the future. That really does. To hear that they're still using that. So to get back to your own storyline, how does your stay at the Rave Palace end? When do you depart, and for what reasons?
So it was a world unto itself, like you said, and there was a certain level. I hate to describe it beyond this, but it's really the best way to describe it is it's 60s Woodstock. Everybody loved each other. There was no fighting. There was no BS in the scene ever. Everybody they had the unspoken rule of plur: peace, love, unity, respect.
Right.
And you never went around and said, plur, man, plur. That was the code. Everybody knew it. And around 2001, I was at a rave in Chicago, and I was seeing my buddy Just One play, actually. And some club kids came in. And ravers and club people are two totally different people.
Explain that.
So we both danced to dance music, but with clubs, it was all about your image, and it was more egotistical.
Yeah, makes sense.
In the rave scene, there was no ego, other than when you're on stage. But when you're in the crowd, you were nobody. Even if you were somebody, you were nobody. And everybody loved each other. So when the club kids come in, they come in their shiny dresses that are form-fitting and tight, and with their attitude of, don't come near me, don't touch me, don't talk to me, that type of standoffish behavior. And at that rave, I remember very specifically, two guys started fighting. And I looked to Jesse at that moment and I said, this is the last rave for me. I'm done. This is dead. And it was. Until, gosh, I did a rave in 2009, but it was a totally different thing. And but the actual rave scene itself, I viewed that was the downfall of it. Kyoki was getting MTV play. We had a couple other DJs that were starting to get more commercial, and pop music was getting integrated into the techno, and it was losing its paradise. The snake had entered Eden, so to speak.
This is the sad part of this interview, isn't it?
Yeah. And that was it. From there on, I mean, we saw it die. That's when you started seeing all the drug raids happening at the raves, because it drew the attention. The club kids started pulling the attention to the raves. It's
an interesting perspective. I will give you that. I kind of felt like the drugs had something to do with the downfall.
Mm-hmm. It was the alpha and the omega, if you will.
Yeah, I get it.
It created it and it destroyed it.
I think it was more than one thing. I mean, sure. Anybody that gets pressed up with federal charges, they were investigating them for, let's say a year or two before they even knew it. You know what I'm saying? So several people from several different angles were doing several different types of research, and they came up with several reasons to besiege this paradise, if you will. Yeah. We had, I'm going to screw up all the names, but it was Disco Donnie down here in New Orleans, and the feds raided him, and I believe they were trying to get him for like tax evasion or something, among other things. But crack house law.
Yep.
And
that was the big one that killed it in Chicago.
Yeah, so
if you were in the building and somebody was dealing, the whole building got arrested.
Y'all went through the same thing up there. That's crazy. Yeah. And did you DJ another rave after that, or that was it?
Not necessarily raves. So in 2003, I actually moved to Metairie, and I DJ'd at a lot of clubs down here.
How soon is this, so I can establish a sort of timeline?
So 2001 is when I walked away from the rave scene.
Okay, so there was quite a span of time.
Yeah, about 2 years.
All right, and then in 2003 you're in Metairie.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was working for Guitar Center, and transferred from that Guitar Center to this one in Chicago to here.
That was, I mean, obviously by choice to some extent, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And what made you choose down here?
They needed a manager, and I needed to see the world.
Okay.
So at that point, I had lived in the Chicago area, the greater Chicago area, for 22 years of my life at that point. And outside of a few gigs in New York or LA DJing, I hadn't really seen the U.S. So I was like, New Orleans has got a big goth community at that time. Still does, from what I've heard. And I was like, those are my people, let's go. Yeah. So I came down here, and yeah.
Well, what do you think? Tell us what you think. I mean, tell us in 2003 terms, you set foot in this place. What were you thinking once you got here? Was it everything you thought it might be?
It was so much more.
Excellent.
I absolutely loved Metairie in New Orleans.
Yeah.
It was, music is everything here, which, being a musician, and that was everything to me. It was an instant meld. It perfectly went in. I loved going to the Quarter, of course. I was 22, going into 23, so French Quarter I hit all the time. I used to hit Antiques, which I found out recently was still open. I used to hang out there all the time, go to the different, the Dungeon, the Dark Entry, all these different clubs all over there. And DJing, and DJs were playing drum and bass and jungle and like a lot of the more breakbeat stuff down here. And there was that, you'll have to forgive me, I think they call it New Orleans bounce at the time, was starting to really take off. And it was, to me, it was paradise. One, I'm allergic to the sun, if you can't tell. And it's hot here, which I love, but the sun's never out. It's always, it's like what you hear of Seattle. It's always raining or gloomy.
That's funny.
And I felt that was perfect. I could go outside all day, not really get sunburn. May get a little burn here and there, but within the first couple weeks, somebody dragged me out to the Metairie Cemetery, which, as a goth kid at the time, that's heaven.
Tickled all your fancies, huh?
Yeah, it was perfect. Every bit of it was perfect, and I unfortunately was not here very long.
Really?
I left after about 5 months.
What was the genesis for that? Well, I don't have to ask. You were forced to leave. So, all right, so Katrina hits. Where do you evacuate to?
So I end up back in Chicago, and with family. You know?
Okay, I was about to say that was because you had resources there.
Right.
Gotcha.
Right. And I had nothing here, so go back there, and that was a dip in the music for me. I had about, that was 04 into 08, 09, I want to say. Yeah, 08. No. No,
You talking about the span of time that you ended up staying there?
No, I still traveled like crazy. So I kept moving. I ended up being like one of the couch surfers.
Okay.
Wherever would take me and my gear. I always traveled with, at the time I still had the Mirage. I had 2 Mirages by that point.
Okay.
I had an ARP Omni, a couple Juno 106, stuff like that. So, no, I take that back. From 04 to 06, I bounced around a little bit. Mm-hmm. Champaign, Illinois, which is southern Illinois. Kind of just all over Illinois, really. 06, I went back, and that's when I joined Grigori 3.
Okay.
So that's when I had a buddy who had known Nox Schwein throughout the time, and he was playing bass for Grigori 3. And his name's Tom. And he was like, hey, we need a keyboardist for this band out in Chicago. Here's their CD. Listen to it, their demo. And listened to it and loved it. I mean, to me, it was Evanescence, but a little darker. Okay. And that's when, but I was saying, I'm so scattered right now. 04 to 06, there was not much music going on for me musically. I mean, I did like one radio show making my noise music solo, but that's it, I think. Yeah. That whole time period, I didn't produce any albums. I don't even think I touched the gear. I think it sat in a shed.
Being displaced, as right. It's been, referred to by everybody, has that effect on you. So I'm mm-hmm. sure I understand. So Grigori 3 was like a darker Evanescence.
That was me selling out.
Really?
That was my selling out. Yep. It was very traditional Gothic rock music. Okay. Very standardized. Bridge, pre-chorus, chorus, verse.
Now, I mean, are you taking some liberties here? I mean, are you saying that song structure is selling out? I mean, what are you trying to say?
No. The Evanescence sound at that time was really big. Yeah. And I felt that Grigori 3 could ride on those coattails.
Gotcha.
So, compared to what I normally make, it was very different. It was very structured. Yeah. At no point have I ever made standard structured music by myself. Okay. But what I mean by selling out was the Evanescence sound. It's very popular at the time.
Sure.
Early 2000s. So female vocalist, the whole 9 yards. Yeah. So.
The engineering aspect, it goes deeper than that. It sounds like for you. Mm-hmm. Did it lack? What did it lack? I guess on the technical end. Did you feel like it was trying to take an industrial sound and cram it into a pop car? Or
that's dead on, actually. That is exactly it.
So it was what they were doing with the sound when they were writing it in the first place.
Right. So they were writing rock songs that had industrial elements. Okay. Almost like Rammstein. Yeah. Especially more modern Rammstein, where there's like maybe one keyboard part somewhere scattered in the song. They wanted the sequencing and the notes and the blips and bloops, if you will, and then some of the pads and strings, which at the time I started getting really big into. And package it with a cool, catchy rock song.
How long did that last for you?
I was only with Grigori 3 a year.
And that was enough for you?
That was more than enough.
I'm assuming you were the catalyst for the parting of ways.
Yes. So there was a many factors in that. So our lead singer was our manager, and I don't mean to mismarch her at all, but she didn't really push for us to get on those coattails. She turned down 2 major tours. One was with Pig, and the second one was with Ministry.
Okay.
And which obviously would have skyrocketed us. We were still doing very, very well in the Chicago scene. We were very mainstream in Chicago. Like I said, that was when we were in Spin Magazine. We were getting interviewed by radio stations constantly. We headlined Gothic Fest in 2005 over, KMFDM side projects and stuff like that.
Talk about it, man.
Yeah, we were really, really on the top of everything. But she kept denying tours. And at the time, and Don't Dip Your Pen in Company Inc., her and I were dating.
Yeah.
And we had broken up. And so that sour taste plus the bad marketing that followed the album. Our album dropped October 06. We dropped the album, and there was no follow-up tour. We were touring before it,
Sure.
but there was nothing.
Well, it's a necessity, unspoken.
Yeah, so it was like, okay, we released the album, and then the band's like, now we'll just relax. And I'm like, no, this is when you push.
Yeah.
This is when you go.
Yep.
And after we used to practice 3 times a week for 5 hours a night. We were so tight. And one day I showed up to the practice venue and just had all my gear still in the case. And everybody else showed up, and I was like, guys, this is it. I'm done. I'm out. And the drummer and the bass player both left with me that night.
With you or at the same time as you?
All the above. Oh, at the same time, sorry. Yeah, they didn't ride with me.
Got you.
Yeah.
But I was just, I guess what I was getting at is you didn't pull like, who's coming with me?
No,
Okay.
no, not at all.
It was the decision you had made for yourself, and I guess the sentiment was amongst many, I guess.
Yeah, I pleaded my case. I said, this is when we're supposed to be pushing. We're not pushing. You've turned down 2 major tours. I feel like you're shooting us in the foot at this point. Do you want to give up reins to somebody else to take management? And she said no. And I was like, okay, cool. Then that's me out.
Yeah.
And the drummer was like, yeah, we're kind of just wasting time at this point.
Where'd you go from there?
So from there, I went into another downtime. That was from, that was probably 07, summer of 07 until early 09. I retired from music pretty much. I play around with synthesizers here and there, but I was kind of done with it.
Did you stay up north?
No. So I moved to Orlando, Florida in 2007.
Okay.
I started going to college and got a bachelor's in film. So while I was in college, I didn't mess with music really. Like I said, I had a couple keyboards laying around. I still DJ'd occasionally, but for the most part, yeah, I felt if I couldn't if the selling out was a failure, then what am I doing?
Sure.
And it put me in quite a dark spot at that time.
How old are you? College years?
So 26 in 2007. I was 26 years old.
And it puts you in a dark spot, not being able to dedicate more time to music?
That and you got the taste of the fame, and then you lost it.
Yeah.
And now you're like, I know how hard I had to work to get there.
Yeah.
Do I work for it again?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it took the wind out of your sails. I get that.
Yeah.
Let me ask though, why did you choose film if music was so near and dear to you? Did you not?
I needed a job.
Okay.
That paid.
Okay. Fair enough.
At the peak of Grigori 3, I think I was making like $25,000 a year.
Yeah.
Take home. And Obviously that didn't pay bills, really.
Yeah.
That was extra income. I was picking up little side jobs here and there in the hospitality industry.
Okay.
But film, I've always had a passion for, even as a kid. Same thing with music, except I never wanted to make it. And I felt if I was going to do something artistic that I could make money on, get in the film industry.
Yeah.
Everybody needs commercials. Everybody needs editors. There's millions of jobs in that industry. So.
Sure. I don't know what it was like back then, but these days it's all kind of blurred together.
Yes.
Like one begets the other. You have to.
Right.
You know.
Well, and that's the advent of, things like YouTube and streaming services and stuff that came in close to that time period. I mean, you figure 2004 really was when we first saw YouTube and Facebook and things like that, but it didn't really take off until around 2006, 2007.
Yeah, that's funny. How have you kind of manifested or put that degree to use since then?
I ran a few YouTube channels. I shot a few independent films that I did myself. They weren't anything big. I honestly haven't used the degree hardly at all.
Yeah.
I do some editing. I've done some light special effects work on some independent films for other people.
Mm-hmm.
That's about it, man. I don't think I've really touched that
Has
much.
it hasn't intertwined with music at all for you?
Not really. I've thought about doing music videos and stuff, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I have no clue. It's weird.
It may not be an intentional decision. It might be something that has to find you, And
Right.
that's okay. It's just like the creative process itself,
Right.
After Grigori 3, what was the next music experience for you?
So after Grigori 3, I really started to lean on the Obsolete Systems project, which I was doing a little bit during. That's my solo noise stuff. I mean, it's just noise. I think I sent you a video on some of it.
Yeah, and you can describe it for them, but the thought occurs to me immediately, you have to have alternate methods of releasing this stuff. You have to have alternate methods of, I guess collaborations still work the same if there's any of that, but you can't do it through conventional means. There is no album. You might be more appealing to, let's say, sync licensing or something like that, but it occurs to me that you take a different path from the traditional artist, whatever that genre is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's the basement musician idea. It's you have to do it all yourself. There's nobody else you can lean on. And like you said, you can collaborate with people, but usually it's people doing the exact same thing, and they're almost never near you. Most of them are in Europe. The music is more popular there, and in Japan, and there's no way to describe it, I think.
Yeah.
It's just when I started doing it, it was for me. I started making music after Grigori 3 and after my break. I started making music I wanted to listen to.
Yeah.
Instead of making music for other people to hear. And like that song that I sent you, the Obsolete Systems one, that was from 2004.
Okay.
My second CD with that. And but we don't do albums, like you said, anymore. There's no such thing. There's no reason to.
It doesn't adhere itself to a format. Do you know what I'm saying? So that's why I question, what avenues do you feel you can pursue?
So, from a financial standpoint, none.
Well, I guess format. Let's start with the simplest.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Since you can't you're not going to be able to put out an album,
right? Per
se, you might put out a sound catalog, I guess.
Right.
What do you see? How do you apply it? I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, that's where the modern day streaming service really helps our genre. in our genres, our noise and stuff, is because you download one song at a time or you stream one song at a time. So that's where we flourish, is when we're doing individual tracks separated from each other. And you can listen to it with others. You also have the DJ scene. I mean, I DJ a lot of that stuff that I still make today, the breakcore and the noise and stuff like that.
I'm sorry, pause for 1 second. I did want to ask you, since you were writing music and you were DJing, were you ever writing music to assist you in segues from tracks, or to help you make something totally different that you could mix to?
Yeah. I wanted to. I really did. Vinyl is so expensive to make, though. And especially then. In '01, it was like one company. Yeah.
It had to be vinyl. You couldn't... There wasn't a Serato. I wasn't even thinking... Okay. Yeah, that's funny.
So I didn't have the option for laptops and stuff like that. And even to this day, like, I've spun on MP3 decks. I did a gig, actually, in February on MP3 decks at the Brick House. And...
how did it feel? Physically,
it's just different. It doesn't... I don't know how to describe it other than different. It's a different world.
Yeah. I
mean, I still have turntables at my house. I still have my vinyl at the house. I still have all of it, and I still practice on it. But it's... with vinyl, there's texture. There's the disc moving, and you stop it, and the platter still spins, but the record doesn't, because you got the slip mat and all of that.
You can physically get the feel of it.
Right. Yeah. It's almost like, and excuse the vulgarity, but it's like making love. It's all about everything at once that's happening. And with the digital turntables, at least for me, with the MP3 decks, it's like using a fleshlight. You get the same outcome, but it's not the same. You don't have everything.
Yeah, I was just curious how it struck you.
Yeah, and okay. But that's how we do our music, though, and promote it now, is with DJing.
I got you. Could you, and I know this is brutal to hold you up to this, but could you please perhaps describe what it is you're talking about, what it is you're making, for people that have maybe never heard you, or maybe never heard the genre?
So...
I mean, it's reminiscent of your, which is interesting to me, reminiscent of your times at the factory. I mean, albeit different, but... Yeah.
So I'm very big on, again, the countings and the mechanical chunking of the rhythm. I once heard it described as the sound of accelerating concrete, and I always felt that was very fitting, if you could try to imagine something like that. But it's... a lot of distortion. It's a lot of experimentation of sound. So you have very hard, heavy drums that usually I will run through reverb, and then I distort the reverb on top of the actual sound itself. Intentional muddying without being bass heavy. Ducking frequencies. It's like stone sculpting with sound.
It's not very easy to describe.
No.
Now, you talked about synesthesia earlier. We're kind of doing the reverse of that, I guess.
Right. How do I tell you what it tastes like?
Right. You know what occurred to me when you said that is, I wondered if the sounds triggered memories of what you... I guess physically ingested being inside of a factory. I mean, certain smells came with certain sounds. They were delivered to you that way every time. So I wondered if one beget the other, triggered the other,
It's very possible, and those sounds do carry with me through life. I could tell you exactly how the machines sound. With a synthesizer, I could tell you how they sound. Yeah. And Yeah, that smell of the oil from the hydrogen hose or the hydraulic hoses spraying the metal down so it doesn't catch on fire and things like that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a certain smell, there's a certain taste, there's a certain everything. Anybody who's worked in a factory, which I have too, you know what that factory smells like. If somebody walks past you in the store and you can smell it and go, they work at the same factory as me.
Sure. Hey, man, I mean, what comes to mind for me is I love old cars.
Yeah, okay.
I love
yeah.
antique cars, and there is a certain smell that you will experience in a car that's, let's say, from the mid-40s, like ancient, you know what I'm
Old
saying?
Graham or something.
And
yeah.
you stick your head in there, and it's unlike anything else. It is a deafening smell if there ever was one.
Yeah.
And it says so much, and it tells you to shut the fuck up because you're in the presence of greatness.
Absolutely.
That's the way I feel, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I totally understand. I wanted to ask you to run down what kind of equipment you're working with now, because I mean, you hesitated because it sounded geeky or techie, but you don't understand. I would hope to welcome some of that audience to the show with something like this, you know.
So I am what they call a gear whore. I am currently using, I'm using a full modular setup. So that's 4 rows of 104 HP of modules. A lot of Behringer 101 clones in that modular, but then I'm also using like a 4MS Ensemble, which is it's like a harmonic synth.
Okay.
So you run a note through it and it harmonizes that note to a scale, and then you can adjust that and layer it, and there's a lot of craziness you can do with it.
Sure.
Using a Moog Grandmother, or Moog, however you want to pronounce it. The debate's always still out there. Hydrasynth, ASM Hydrasynth. I'm using, I have a EMU Emax 2, which is a sampler from 1987 that Depeche Mode used to use. Let's see, a Virus TI2. I use a lot of effects pedals like a Boss DS1. I still use the DS1. To me, that's the king of pedals and always will be.
Okay.
I've got a TC Electronics June 60, which is a Juno 60 chorus. It's an infamous Roland chorus sound in a pedal. Akai S5000, Akai MPC Live 2, Roland MV8000, Alesis 3630 on compressor. I've got, I'm trying to think, a Spirit 8 mix console, which I use for, it's a British mix console.
Okay.
Because the British EQs on the analog consoles sound very unique.
Right.
And so I use that. And it's got direct outs for every channel, so I can run effects per channel instead of having to do inserts.
Luxurious.
Yeah, yeah. Massive. It's horrible.
Yeah.
Let's see. Studio Logic Sledge 2.0. I just took my Quasi MIDI Sirius from Germany over to a synth repair shop to get some power fixes in it. And Sonic SD1. Behringer RD9, which is a TR909 replica.
Okay.
TD3, which is their TB303 clone. ARP 2600. Roland JV 1080. Korg Trinity Rack, which I use for my pads and strings. Best string machine in the world for modern sound strings. If you're doing soundtrack work, it's perfect. Boss DR5 drum machine, which is a vintage drum machine.
Okay.
$90 on eBay right now, probably, and it's probably the backbone of all my drums. Probably one of the best drum machines ever made. It was made for guitarists, funny enough. All the buttons are guitar scales.
Nice.
Trying to think of my room right now with everything set up. Behringer Pro VS, which is a clone of the Prophet VS by Sequential Circuits, which is a vector synth. That's there. And then for speakers, I'm using classic V8 KRK monitors.
KRKs.
Yeah, the classics, not the rockets. I always recommend the classics.
Gotcha.
They're actually flat. The rockets tend to be a bit bass heavy.
You realize you're not traveling heavy now. I mean, you're not traveling light now, and I say that because when we spoke previously, you were telling me about soon going to Japan. So, I mean, are you going to have to get rid of all your babies, or what are you going to do? That's a lot.
I'm liquidating everything except the Hydrasynth, the VST, or the TI2, the Virus, and my modular. And the monitors, of course.
Okay.
Other than that, yeah. The console.
So this just became like a 2-hour for sale sign.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, hopefully somebody hears this and realizes,
Yeah, if you're looking for studio gear, I got a bunch.
Man,
and synths.
that's the gamut too, because that's new and old. That's clones and originals. That's foreign and domestic. I mean, you could name opposite ends of the spectrum on all accounts.
Digital, analog.
Tell them about Japan, man.
So, I'm looking to move to Japan, or I am moving to Japan soon. And, musically over there, I'm seeing a lot of what I missed from the late 90s and early 2000s from here.
You brought it up while we were speaking, yeah.
Yeah, there's a experimentation going on that's very open. Noise music in itself has been big there since the 80s. There's artists like Merzbow or Chu Ishikawa that have been making stuff that I used to listen to when I was a teenager.
Okay.
That was, I mean, if you listen to a Merzbow record, it sounds like static on a TV for an hour and a half long. And the fact that, he's a fairly big musician over there. A lot of my industrial bands that I listen to or even work with all do big in Japan. So musically, for me, it's beautiful. And then when it comes to how people interact with each other, to lean on, as we were talking about, kind of the degradation of our society and what we're going through, to me it's more appealing over there, in the fact that people treat each other with respect, egos are in check. There's a certain harmony that's there still in their society.
Sure.
And they're bigger than us when it comes to population density and stuff. Tokyo's got 35 million people in it, which is Chicago, LA, and New York combined in one city, and it's half the footprint of Chicago.
Yeah. So
just societal purposes, I think it's a beautiful place. I can't wait to go. And to see a different world. I've lived half my life in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
It's time to spend the other half in a place completely different.
Yeah. What can we expect from you? What do you think this is going to lead to musically, publicly?
So I've got a new project I'm working on called Doriru, which is Japanese for drill.
Spell it if you don't mind for them.
Doriru.
Okay.
And it's like dark ambience and industrial combined. I'm going to have more vocal work in it, which, again, I approach vocals like I do my synthesizers. Your synthesizer is your base starting point, no matter what sound you make, and everything else comes from that. So my vocal chain right now is 12 effects units. So it's barely audible as a person. But it's going to have, the sound itself is going to be far less abrasive as the Obsolete Systems stuff or my previous work. It isn't going to be. It is a lot more atmospheric and a lot more based on. The best way I can describe it is I call them noiseescapes. It's audio that takes you to a landscape.
Sure.
I want it to be almost hallucinogenic. Where when you hear it and you listen to it, it takes you somewhere.
Okay.
Be it emotionally or mentally or physically.
Do you feel like going to Japan is going to compound your, I guess, opportunities or abilities?
I don't care.
Well, I mean, what's the reason?
Oh, you mean like to physically go there?
Yeah. What's the? I'm to that. I'm countering with what's the reason for choosing there? If you don't feel like it's going to have a direct effect on any of your music.
I think from a spiritual standpoint, it'll hold different.
Okay.
And that would put me most likely in a different headspace. And that's why what I've made with Doriru so far versus what I will make may be two totally different worlds.
Sure. Could be.
Because, right sense. Now everybody's hearing the Chicago kid who grew up in a factory.
Sure.
Maybe over there they're going to hear the nature kid who...
Right.
Praise to Buddha or something.
Yeah. It's funny, man. It may be totally irrelevant, but it popped in my head as you were saying that there are no straight lines in nature.
No.
But there are plenty of them in a factory, though, so you're going to be in a different world yourself,
Exactly.
Where can they find anything that you have out now?
Currently, anything that I've made is all over the internet. I hate to say it, I don't have anything direct. I'm opening a Bandcamp, hopefully by the time this comes out.
Yeah.
I'll have a Bandcamp made up for Doriru, which is Doriru.
Okay.
And we'll have some stuff there.
Now you don't have a choice. You realize now you have to do it because
now.
You just said you're on the record,
Yeah, I have to.
Yeah, that's funny. Well,
sure.
Thank you for your time, man.
Thank you for having me, man.
All right.
I appreciate it.
Definitely.